The biggest question that most will have heading into Darkest Dungeon 2 will be if it's better than Darkest Dungeon, and the short answer is yes. Getting the biggest gripe out of the way, you don't form the same relationships with certain characters that you did in the original, as Darkest Dungeon 2 is focused on a shorter run-based gameplay loop where you pick 4 of your familiar classes to form your party and venture out towards the mountain to defeat the main source of evil that is currently spreading. If you die, which you will often, you start back at the start, fully able to equip these same 4 classes again if you choose to do so. The main journey is basically a much darker version of the Oregon Trail as you travel Badlands trying to survive from one inn to the next. You do this by basically traversing an interactive Slay the Spire style map, and sadly, this is one of the least fun areas of the game as it feels sluggish to control and slows down the time between the fun parts, which is managing your party and slaying evil. The good news is that the main pillar of Darkest Dungeon 2 is the tried and true combat system mechanics that you remember from the first. Immediately in Darkest Dungeon 2, you can feel a much higher level of refinement and polish, with the most obvious being the visuals moving to 3D. Then you also have things like intros, title cards, animations, and a score that sets a much higher level of atmosphere and cinematic quality that Darkest Dungeon just didn't have. While you might not be able to become close with certain characters, one of the new features is the introduction of origin stories for each class that are an absolutely amazing addition, and in some cases it's just a little bit of lore, but in other cases you're thrown into a recreation of a memory, such as the Highwayman and his beginnings as a prisoner and how he managed his escape, which was the first of 5 backstories for that character class. One of the biggest disappointments with Darkest Dungeon 2 is that it wasn't optimized for Steam Deck at the time of review, which comes as a surprise since Darkest Dungeon 1 already worked perfectly on consoles. It still works on Steam Deck, but it requires some awkward controls for the most part. The good news is that Red Hook have already confirmed that this is a priority for them, which is great because the nature of the game lends itself to jumping in for a battle when you only have a few minutes to spare. Darkest Dungeon 2 is still extremely difficult at times, bordering on the point of unfair thanks to an RNG system that can easily turn the tide of battle either way. Darkest Dungeon 2 feels much more like a roguelite than the first did, as runs can last anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours, but your untimely demise is part of the journey as you learn from your losses, grab your earnings, upgrade what you can, and head back out slightly stronger. Red Hook kept what was great about the original and made some changes with some of the pain points to provide a much more refined experience this time around. It's hard to be critical about a new game without referencing the previous work of the studio, and it's even more difficult to talk about Darkest Dungeon 2 without mentioning Darkest Dungeon. The sequel has made a number of changes that will likely alienate some, but will overall welcome more newcomers as well as bring back fans of the original to this little hamlet for a different experience.